Thank you very much. Hi everyone. I'm aware we're getting closer to lunch, so I hope people will be tolerant with us and be able to stay focused. My name's Indigo, Rachel and Lisa. So we've split our presentation today up into 3 sections, so you'll get to hear a bit from each of us, but you're stuck with me first, so that could be good or bad, but we'll see how it goes. And just so, people, we have quite commonly employ consumers to be a part of mental health service delivery, but also work with policy in the department. But I'm not sure that happens so often in other parts of health. So if people aren't aware, that's what it sort of means to be a senior consumer advisor. So, hello. So I'm someone who spent many years in and out of psychiatric hospital as a consumer a number of years back, but off and on for about 9 years. I had, you don't need to know my whole story, but I had diagnoses of schizophrenia and borderline, amongst others, and variable experiences, which if we have time, I'll tell you a snippet about towards the end. But these days I use my lived experiences and also my connection with many other consumers and patients to inform how we think about policy and service delivery. So it's quite a privilege to be able to work in that way. So that's what that's about. So our presentation is split into 3. The first section I'll talk with you about is what does Safewards have to do with the subject of today, which is occupational violence. Rachel will talk with us some more about what Safewards actually is, what it's all about. And then Lisa's going to share some practical strategies that we hope people can take away with them from today and back to your different workplaces. So that's now which button do you reckon? This one? Yeah. No, that one. Press them all, said Lisa. I'm normally good at pressing people's buttons, but... So how does Safewards relate to occupational violence? Something that's really central to Safewards is that it's about safety for both staff and patients, which is something I probably quite obviously particularly like about this model, that it requires us to think about everyone together, which is part of our title for today, that we are in this together. And so the way that it does that, if we look at the, I'll just press that button too, the foundations of the research that led to the development of the Safewards model looked at the relationship between 2 different things. If we read the Safewards literature, the terminology used is conflict and containment. But for the purposes of today, we've put up there occupational violence and restrictive practice, which is close enough to the definitions of what these things mean. If you dive into Safewards, conflict includes more than occupational violence. It's anything that's actual harm or that carries the risk of harm. So it could include verbal or physical aggression or property damage, or people absconding, which I should confess, although I'm not sure it's the right audience, I'll see if I get a laugh, but I was a serial and quite expert absconder from services. I got a laugh, that's good, in my day. And I don't share my secrets about how I did it. Thankfully, that didn't lead to harm. But today's about occupational violence, but what Safewards tells us is that these 2 things have a relationship with each other. So restrictive practices used for patients relate to occupational violence experienced by staff. And so if we move on to, it's this button, isn't it? This next slide. This is sort of a different way for us to think about that same subject. So what we've got here, and in the middle we've talked about cultures of control. Now mental health is different to other parts of health. We have a Mental Health Act that allows space for compulsory detention and treatment, which is in many ways different to other parts of health, but I think that restriction still happens in all parts of health in different ways. So I hope this still feels relevant. And what we see, if I do this, can you guys, no, you can't see the little arrow. That's okay. If we start up the top, we see here restrictive interventions. Imagine that's where we begin on this cycle. That a restrictive intervention, which in mental health, but potentially in other parts of health as well, is something that's done to control a person. So we might see the use of seclusion room or restraints. We might see special observations. There could be a whole range of things that are done to control that person. Now, a natural reaction to being controlled, which is not something that just patients have, but actually anyone, is to be fearful, when we're controlled, yeah? So people feel afraid of that, and we've got three big responses, three things we can do when we're fearful that are sort of innate in us. We can fight, we can flee and get out of there, or we can freeze like a deer in the headlights. One of the issues we've got, particularly in mental health units, is that it's very hard to flee when the unit's locked. You could be a skillful absconder like me, and people do abscond, but it's difficult to flee. So one of those natural reactions to if you don't feel safe isn't there. And that could be quite true as well in other places. If you feel frightened in an emergency department, is it that easy to get out if you feel the need to get out? And to freeze can also present problems. If people have that freeze reaction, that may be seen as a worsening of mental health, which might lead to more restrictive interventions anyway. So there's kind of a loop. So in some ways, what we do in services is increase the likelihood of a fight reaction, because flee and freeze are taken off us. So greater likelihood of fight, and what does that lead to, of course, down the bottom of the cycle? Occupational violence. And then what we see coming out the other side is the exact same thing for staff as we saw for patients. How do the staff feel? Afraid. And what are our options? Can you go running out of the service? Well, you can, I guess. So, you know, you've got a swipe pass for the door, which is something we don't usually have as a patient. But that's not really an option, is it, if this is your career, this is your job, and you're there trying to make a difference. Freeze is also really difficult, although we see that as well. We see many health workers develop all sorts of burnout, compassion fatigue, sick leave. And I think sometimes we do see things like flight. If we see a sort of mass exodus of staff to the nurses' station, or the fishbowl is kind of another kind of flight, perhaps too. But actually fight is left as potentially the more likely option there as well. And so what do we do when we're fighting? We're trying to get control. More restrictive interventions. And so it's not in reality as simple as this, but what this tells us is that there is a relationship between these things, and this can be a very difficult cycle to get out of, and it's not helpful for staff, and it's not helpful for patients. So what we get with Safewards is, I guess, a model that asks us to think differently, to step out of that cycle, and it gives us a framework of understanding what's actually happening in services and for people using services, and it gives us a lot of practical strategies or interventions to use to set up a different kind of culture, a sort of culture that's focused on care, or we might call it a Safewards culture. And so rather than restrictive interventions, our absolute focus is how do we pull back to a therapeutic intervention? What can we do in this moment that's going to be most helpful for everyone, and that's also going to keep everyone safe? If we do that, we have patients that feel safe, who are then going to be more likely to trust and hope that something positive comes out of this. Down the bottom, we're more likely to see a positive connection and understanding, which means what? Staff are going to feel safe if people are connecting and being understanding, and we continue that cycle of trust. Again, it's not quite so simple in the real world, but it's a very different kind of model that can take us to very different and much more positive places. So before I finish up and hand over to Rachel to take you through the more practicalities of what the model looks like, and Lisa will share some of the interventions as well, I just wanted to share something a bit personal. It's what we often like to do, those of us who work in consumer roles, but I guess it's feels like an important reflection to make given the subject today. And I wanted to start, I guess, it's interesting, as someone, particularly someone who's been diagnosed with schizophrenia, a lot of people don't realise how common experiences of trauma and child abuse can be amongst those of us who end up in health services, and particularly mental health services. But it's actually incredibly common, so more than 85% of us have a history of violence in our childhoods. And I'm also a child who experienced quite significant, I'm not a child now, I was a child, who experienced significant neglect and violence and abuse. So this subject touches me quite profoundly and in a whole lot of different ways, what we're talking about today. But when I was a child, at the age of 13, I was abducted. And I'm not going to go into the details of that because it's horrible, and we've sort of heard a lot of triggering horrible things today. I don't want to add to that. But it was quite horrific, and I want you to think about this short description. strangers come into my home and they take me away. I don't want to go with them, but they make me. And they take me to a strange place and I'm locked in there. And there's locks on locks on locks and I have to take all my clothes off. And I'm really scared and I'm cold. And then they make me take substances and I don't know what's happening to me. And I've never been so terrified. And I often share this and I ask people to think about what I'm describing, because I'm describing two things. I'm describing my abduction as a child, but I'm also describing my last admission to a psychiatric unit, because that was what happened. And I share it very specifically to remind us about the things that can sometimes lead to challenging behaviours, difficult behaviours, but actually quite understandable behaviours if we know a person's story. That when I'm unwell, like many of my fellow consumers, I'm usually reliving the worst, most terrifying experiences of my life. And it looks and sounds really strange to other people, I do understand that, but what's going on is nightmarish stuff inside my head. And I think we have a problem when the services that are there to help and the people that want to help actually play a role in recreating the worst nightmare of my life, in offering that help. And I think I share that because I hope it goes some way towards helping to understand why sometimes we do what we do when we turn up to services, why we try very hard to get away from the police, because I've been in a divvy van too, or very hard to get away from the ambulance officers or the emergency department. So I share that, and I guess I share it because this is common for many consumers. I share it because I think today's really important. I absolutely agree that violence is not okay. I think it is not okay that health workers don't feel safe and aren't safe at work, but I also think that patients should be safe as well. And I guess there's a part of this conversation that can easily be missing when we think about occupational violence, is violence that's experienced by the people who use our sector. And I guess what I really love about Safewards is that it reminds us that we are in it together, and that one of the best routes for everyone to be safe is for everyone to be safe. And when we think about safety, that we think about the safety of everyone together. So, sorry my voice got a bit wobbly, it's quite a personal thing to share, but I want to hand over to Rachel, who's going to give you proper scientific stuff about the model and won't be so awkward. But thank you.
Thanks, Indy. It's going to obviously be quite difficult to follow on from that. Can I just get a show of hands of who's heard of Safewards before, knows a little bit about it? Great. Most of you. That's fantastic. So this might be a refresher for some of you. So just in way of background, a bit of the basics really around Safewards. It's a model. It came from the UK. There's a lot of research behind the model. Professor Len Bowers, who is in charge of putting the model together, has done a lot of his own research, over 20 years worth of research, trying to understand what makes psychiatric units particularly unsafe, what some of the events are, how and when they happen. He also looked at extensive research that was done in this space by others, nearly 1,200 articles that was trying to understand the complexities of inpatient units, predominantly in and around the UK, but he did look a bit broader, and then tried to make sense of that and put it into a nice, neat package that people on the ground could actually understand and work with, and try and create safer spaces both for the people that we work for, but also for the staff as well. So there's a solid evidence behind it in trying to understand the conflict, as Indy was talking about. So there are all those events that potentially might lead to risks for the patients, but also for the staff, and to understand those things that staff may do in response to that can also increase the risk of further harm, both again for the patients and for the staff. So trying to understand the relationship between those two things. This was something that was introduced here in Victoria, and some of you here were involved in a trial that was conducted in 7 health services in 2014 and 15. That was introduced into 18 inpatient units across the state. We introduced the model as well as the 10 interventions, which I will talk a little bit about. And part of that evaluation here in Victoria found that it also had applicability in mental health settings in a Victorian context, as well as broader applicability. So not just in adult acute inpatient settings, which is where the research comes from, but also in extended care units, aged acute units, adolescent and youth settings as well. So a lot broader than just adult settings. We are now in a new phase of Safewards, and we are now introducing it, in the process of introducing it into all mental health inpatient units across the state. So we've done train-the-trainer sessions in 8 services so far across the state, and we're engaging with services around both training and implementation of this model. Obviously, we see broader application across the state. The next phase, which will be happening at the end of next year, will be looking at introducing it into the emergency departments and into general settings. And there already has been some work that's been happening across the state in these areas. It's being piloted in Peninsula and La Trobe as well, to see what adaptations might be necessary in other health settings. But most people, when they understand the model, can definitely see how it would fit in a broader health context. So that's just a bit of the background. The model essentially looks a little bit like this. The model is looking at features of an inpatient unit that could potentially increase the likelihood of those behaviours that could cause risk to patients and staff. And so there's 6 areas, as you can see there. So it looks at things such as what the staff bring to the situation, what's happening for the patients themselves, how patients are interacting with each other, the physical environment, the rules and regulations that are going to impact on the patients as well, and the things that are happening for people outside of the hospital environment. As well as the model, and in understanding that, there's also a set of 10 interventions, which was part of a trial in the UK. We also trialled that in Victoria, and we've been using these 10 particular interventions to try and address some of the risk factors that can come from inpatient settings. So that's the model very briefly. Just to explain, I guess, the process and how it works a little bit, you'll notice here that there's 4 boxes along the bottom, and that's really depicting a chain of events that we know occurs in inpatient settings. So on the left, you'll see the originating domains, which is those 6 features that I mentioned before that make up an inpatient setting that could potentially lead to flashpoints. And flashpoints are essentially triggers that can arise from those features of an inpatient setting that may then very quickly turn into a conflict event. The conflict event can often then lead to containment, which is anything that could be restrictive, and obviously Indy's already mentioned some examples of those. And what we need to recognise is the relationship between the conflict event and the containment, because there's always a real risk that when we're using restrictive interventions, we're going to see an increase in that conflict behaviour. So the model is trying to help us understand what's happening, when it's happening, and how it's happening, and then trying to think about how we could be more proactive in reducing the likelihood of that conflict behaviour. So you'll notice the staff modifiers, and it's really identifying all along that chain of events opportunities where we can actually intervene. Some of the interventions are particularly relevant at certain points along this chain of events, which I'll just quickly outline because I don't have a lot of time left. In terms of the originating domains and being a lot more proactive and trying to lay a good foundation for connection and that therapeutic relationship, know each other is a nice way of doing that, where we're sharing a bit about each other and trying to build rapport and common humanity. Clear expectations is where everyone on the unit, both staff and patients, come together with an agreed list of expectations that's trying to make building that relationship a lot easier and spending time together, which is more of a trying to redress that power imbalance that we know happens on our units. Positive words is particularly around handover, and that's trying to understand what's happening for the person, what is contributing to the behaviours that we're seeing, and how can we work with that, what's a helpful strategy. So they're a bit more around prevention. If we are seeing opportunities for patients to modify what's happening in terms of how they support each other, these interventions, particularly discharge messages and mutual help meeting, are a really lovely way of doing that, both by patients leaving messages for other patients, but also supporting each other in a group setting, and using the opportunities to connect with each other in a positive way. if we are likely to see flashpoints or triggers that arise from what's happening in our environments, these interventions can be really helpful. So it's around how we debrief our consumers after an incident, so we don't see further incidents as a consequence of that. Bad news mitigation is thinking about how we plan for either delivering bad news if it's something that we're involved in, or being responsive when someone receives bad news, and ensuring that we're not going to see further conflict as a result of that. And Safewards is thinking about when we need to set limits, actually thinking about, do we need to set this limit, how are we going to set this limit, and what supports we're going to put in place for the person. And a bit further along the chain of events, sometimes we need to engage a bit more assertively around using de-escalation skills with the person. So talk down is a process of de-escalation, which is trying to focus on being respectful and empathetic, and calm down methods is some items that are assisting somebody to self-regulate in those situations where it might be quite difficult using sensory items. So they're the interventions, and I'm going to pass you on to Lisa to give you some more practical tips.
My heart's jumping out of my chest, and I don't know why, because I actually love attention. I love talking in front of people, so maybe if you smiled a bit more at me, I might be okay. I'm also aware that I'm about to sell you an apple when you're holding a chocolate bar prior to lunch. So just be aware that, yeah, that helped, 5 minutes. So just be aware that when we train with these interventions, that we can do this in 3 full days. And I've got 5 minutes, so I'm going to highlight 3. And be kind. And I'm very grateful that we've followed Dr. Nicole Lee, because one of the interventions is about positive words, and it is about having psychological understanding of what is occurring. So that's one thing I'm grateful for Dr. Nicole Lee, and the other thing is that she's opened up the door to be able to say, holy shit cow. So these are the 3 interventions that I'm going to briefly talk about. Along that spectrum that Rachel showed, which is the originating domains, flashpoints, or some people might be more familiar with the term triggers, and conflict. So positive words, these 3 interventions I think are quite potential to OVA. Starting with positive words, which is a focus on more of the prevention. So typically positive words does target clinical handover, and it identifies language, attitude and culture, not just individually but in the workplace as well. Safewards is an intervention about setting limits, which I'm sure a lot of people here would agree can be a very tough thing to do, and can often be the pivot point of where things can start to go wrong. And talk down, which is a de-escalation model for a process during a conflict. And I think especially people that do a lot of reviewing of incidents of occupational violence and aggression, a lot of documentation will say the situation escalated, so de-escalation was required, and that doesn't help a lot because I don't know what that means, unless it's about riding up and down stairs that don't move, which we love because that takes less stress. But de-escalation sometimes doesn't mean a lot to a lot of people, especially if you're a new clinician or a healthcare professional. Does everyone agree with that? Thank you. The first intervention, positive words. Our brains see negative and positive information very differently. And generally, we just reflect on the negative, and the language around that can be very strong, more so than positive. So you really can set a tone for a shift when you're using negative language, and particularly when it is around challenging behaviours and things, you do tend to think that you're handing over a risk, but what you're actually doing is setting a real tone for negativity. And so positive words is about turning that around, identifying the language we use, and how, as strongly as negative language can work, positive language can work just as strongly. And it's such an obvious thing to see, particularly in your workplace with culture and attitude. And if we... Oh, I've gone... My mouth's so dry, it's just ridiculous. That's okay, it's playing into my whole attention thing here. So positive language, setting the tone. If you have a positive mindset, you will approach an incident in a more positive manner. Soft words. Oh, that's okay, it'll just end up going up there. Softwords, this intervention aims to expand skills and choices for staff when you're setting limits. There's a lot of tips and tools that can be used in this intervention, and the training around it's really important. It is a means of reminding staff to always use the best style of communication in difficult situations. I think that's really important. If you think about setting a limit, particularly around the common thing at the moment, or has been for a little while, is no smoking and things like that. Often your clinicians or staff, all staff, have to sort of deliver that message, and it can be a real tough one. It can be a real point where things can go quite awful. And then what's the organisation's expectations if that person, are you then to become an enforcer, or are you actually just providing advice, education and some assistance to that person? So Softwords certainly is about, do you have to set really hard limits? Can you say yes? Can you say yes sometimes? How do you react when others set limits on you? Yeah. Think about that. So talk down, this is a really important model, and we do love this because it is a process, and I think that a lot of people here would identify really strongly with, probably even from a young age or school age, DR ABC. It's sort of like this thing, isn't it, that you would know what that was if I said to you, what's Dr. ABC? Danger response. Yep. So talk down can be about having that process locked in as well, so that when you're approaching a situation that can be confronting and aggressive, am I going too far over? No. That you think of this process: delimit, clarify, resolve. So if you've got nothing else and all sensibilities start to flat, take a few deep breaths, remain in control, remain empathetic and respectful. And if you can do that, and you can think of these 3 arrows, we might get through this situation okay. So delimit, which is exactly what that is. Am I in the safest place to be able to start this process of de-escalation? Do I need some people to be removed? Are all the people aware that need to be, that I'm approaching this situation? I think the most important thing we often miss, I will speak for myself actually, is clarifying. So I think sometimes we go from, this is a situation, I've made it safe, now I just need to resolve this so we can all get through it safely. But we forget to ask the middle bit, which is, what is it that you need? I'm going to clarify the situation here. What is it that you want? And can I help you with that? It's also about recognising with that person and reminding them of the relationship that we have, reminding them that no one wants to get hurt, so let's get through this. And these arrows can be a bit interchangeable sometimes. And then the last thing is resolve. Can I actually offer what this person wants in a nice manner, or at least support or offer some alternatives? So that's what this model of de-escalation is, and I think it's really important, especially for beginning practitioners. And like I said, it will only succeed if you remain in control and express respect and empathy at all times. I got through it. Okay. You would be surprised. I normally love doing this stuff. I'm really scared of you guys. Thank you. There is a website, and I really encourage you to get on it. We've got all this information on there about Safewards. It's all free. Go and have a look at it. There's some really cool videos on there of Rachel, and lots of resources, lots of great posters with things like these models, and goes into much, much greater detail. So thank you for accepting the apple when you had the chocolate bar in your hand.